Arianespace gets a new CEO, the Crew 10 astronauts see their flight being delayed, a spacewalk record is broken on the Chinese space station, and Starlink is coming to your phone. We'll have all that and a whole lot more this week in Spaceflight. With 2024 coming to an end, the retirement of the International Space Station is coming closer than ever. That event is currently planned for 2030, and while that might still seem like the distant future, NASA is getting its plans in order for what to do next. The agency has been slowly shifting its focus from low Earth orbit to the moon and beyond, but it doesn't want to leave low Earth orbit altogether either. This week, NASA finalized its strategy for maintaining a presence in low Earth orbit after astronauts closed the doors, or hatches, on humanity's primary orbital outpost for the last time. The ISS will be succeeded by commercial space stations, and the strategy outlines how the agency hopes to position itself as a customer of these commercial ventures. First, NASA determined that its primary need is long-duration missions of at least 6 months to a year. The agency concluded that shorter missions of 1 to 6 months are of limited value for reaching its goals. This is because the agency ultimately wants to send humans to Mars, and there's simply no way to do that with a short mission. The Mars missions will likely last multiple years. So to prepare for them, NASA wants to perform long-duration missions in the relative safety of low Earth orbit. By developing and testing technology closer to home, NASA hopes to mitigate any risks for trips to the moon and Mars. To make these missions possible and cost-effective, NASA also wants to help the industry develop safe and reliable stations in low Earth orbit. These stations, or destinations as NASA calls them, should be interoperable, meaning that they're all built using the same standards and could, for example, be served by any of the same vehicles. With these destinations, NASA hopes to create a workforce of experienced astronauts and ground crews. According to the document, flight experience in low Earth orbit won't be required for astronauts on future Artemis and Mars missions, but it probably wouldn't look too bad on an astronaut's CV. NASA also wants more science in low Earth orbit. For example, the strategy mentions topics like the effects of microgravity on organisms, reacclimatization to life on Earth, material science, and advancing physics. In general, NASA wants to speed up the way that science is performed in space by analyzing and iterating experiments on orbit. What's more, NASA also wants to focus on developing the technology required for missions beyond low Earth orbit, and while doing all of this, they want to spearhead international collaboration. Finally, the agency wants to engage students and the public and inspire them to get excited about spaceflight. Now that is certainly a mission that we can get behind. And hey, if you want to follow along and get inspired by NASA's future in space, as well as all of the other space news, subscribe and click the bell to get notified whenever we post our next spaceflight update. And if you like space news, go ahead and click that like button as well. One of the commercial space stations that will take over from the ISS is the Axiom station. This week, Axiom updated its roadmap for getting that station up and running. Axiom station is set to start out attached to the ISS while more and more of its modules are being attached. Once completed, the station would then detach and operate on its own. The new plans accelerate this process as they don't require the station to actually be completed before it's detached. This way, the station can detach as early as 2028, 2 years sooner than originally planned. Axiom will achieve this by switching around the order in which the modules will be launched. On the updated roadmap, the Payload Power Thermal Module will be the first to be launched. This will be followed by a habitat, an airlock, another habitat, and finally the research and manufacturing facility. Some of the modules are already in production by Thales Alenia Space, which will also now have to alter its plans as well. For instance, to get the Payload Power Thermal Module ready in time, Thales Alenia will repurpose some sections originally meant for the habitats. With this change, the module should be ready to ship to Axiom by fall of next year. According to Axiom Space, the roadmap changed after NASA asked the company to revise its plans. But there may also be another reason. Axiom is reportedly dealing with financial struggles, and this change of plans could be a very convenient outcome in that regard. But of course, that's just speculation. Another company that's building its own space station is VAST. We've talked about their progress on many previous episodes, but this time we've got a different update. VAST announced that it has signed a deal with SpaceX to launch 2 crewed missions to the ISS. These missions are part of VAST's bid for NASA's private astronaut mission program. Axiom has flown 3 of these missions already and is getting ready to fly the next this year, but they already have their eyes set on the 5th and 6th. By operating these flights, the company hopes to learn from NASA's expertise and gain experience for missions to its own stations. Of course, NASA hasn't assigned these missions just yet, so we'll have to see whether VAST gets to do it after all. In the meantime, the company is looking for customers. Last month, it signed a memorandum of understanding with the Czech Republic, which included the option to fly a Czech astronaut to the space station. One mission we'll definitely see flying to the ISS is the upcoming Crew 10 mission, but we'll have to wait just a bit longer as NASA and SpaceX have announced a delay. The mission was originally slated to launch in February, but it's now expected no earlier than late March. With this mission, SpaceX plans to add a brand new Dragon spacecraft to its fleet, bringing the total number of Crew Dragons to 5. But apparently, the new vehicle needs a little longer to get ready for prime time. According to NASA, the delay is needed to give teams some extra time to complete processing on the new Dragon. Crew 10's delay also therefore delays the return of the Crew 9 mission, whose members are currently on the International Space Station. Crew Dragon Freedom arrived at the ISS in late September with Nick Hague and Alexander Gorbanov on board, with 2 other seats reserved for Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams, the 2 astronauts who arrived at the station on Starliner in June. Their mission was originally planned to last just 8 days, but with the new delays, it might last nearly 10 months. And now we'll take a glimpse at some other stories across space, starting with Firefly's moonlander, Blue Ghost, which arrived in Florida this week. The lander's outfitted with 10 science and technology experiments that will operate on the lunar surface for about 2 weeks, or 1 lunar day. To get there, Blue Ghost is slated to launch mid-January atop a Falcon 9. This is Firefly's first attempt at landing on the moon, but it plans to send a lander every year. This week, the company was awarded a NASA contract for the 3rd mission in this series, which is scheduled for 2028. NASA wants to outfit the lander with 6 instruments, including a radio telescope and a robotic arm. This mission will also feature a rover to explore the landing site at the Gruithuisen Domes and study its geology. ArianeGroup is making progress on the Themis rocket prototype, which it's building for the European Space Agency in order to demonstrate recovery and reuse technologies. ArianeGroup recently announced that it's completed the first mechanical integration of this prototype. Photos show Themis being moved around in the factory at Les Mureaux in France. At some point, this rocket is set to perform some low-altitude hop tests where it'll fly up to 100 meters, descend, and softly touch down, much like the early Falcon 9 and Starship prototypes. But it's not ready to do that just yet, as the photos show a lack of engines. To make this stainless steel structure a functional rocket, ArianeGroup will first have to install the Prometheus rocket engine. This is Europe's first methane-powered engine, and it's being developed specifically for reusable vehicles. And from ArianeGroup, we go to its subsidiary, Arianespace, which announced that its CEO, Stefan Israel, will leave the company by the end of the year. Israel had been in charge of the company since 2013. During his tenure, Arianespace phased out the Ariane 5, Soyuz, and the original Vega rocket and developed their successors, Ariane 6 and Vega C. Ariane 6 completed its first test flight this year, and Vega C recently returned to flight after a failure 2 years ago. With both rockets now ready for action, Israel is leaving the company for a new career opportunity elsewhere. He'll pass the baton to 36-year-old David Kevayulas, who is formerly ministerial advisor for French space policy, but his first goal will need to be ramping up the launch cadence from a standstill, as the company has many launches planned for 2025. He'll also have to position the company to survive in a market that's being taken over by cheaper, reusable rockets. We're looking forward to what Kevayulas has in store, and we wish him all of the best at his new job. Starlink might be coming to your cell phone. If you're a regular viewer, you're probably aware that SpaceX has been launching Starlink satellites with direct-to-cell capability for a while now. Recently, the company completed the first constellation of this type of Starlink satellites, and this week, telecom providers started rolling out the functionality to their customers. T-Mobile has opened registration for a beta program that all of its US customers can now sign up for. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, 1NZ has also made the Starlink service available to their eligible customers. Both carriers offer the service for free, so their customers can send and receive text messages in areas without regular cell coverage. There are some limitations, however. First, not all phones are compatible with the technology. Second, the technology is also limited to text messages, at least for now. According to 1NZ, these text messages may take over 10 minutes to be delivered, though it should usually take less than 3 minutes. But as more satellites are launched, delivery times of these space texts are expected to improve. On Thursday, 1NZ posted an update on social media saying that its customers have already sent over 20,000 messages through Starlink. Work continues on the orbital launch mount, but this time, it's Rocket Lab's. The company's building a launch site for its upcoming Neutron rocket at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport, or MARS, in Virginia. This week, the company shared more photos of the massive steel structure. A lot has changed compared to the last time that we saw it. The team has now completed the full upper deck of the structure, which is what the rocket will sit on before liftoff. To withstand the massive forces of liftoff, this part is really beefy. It's constructed out of 160 tons of steel. To further protect the structure and the rocket, the launch mount is outfitted with a water deluge system, and Rocket Lab announced that this part has also been completed. Now let's take a look at the space traffic this week and see what the end of the year will bring us in spaceflight. It's once again been a very active week, so let's begin at the start with, of course, a Starlink launch. Liftoff took place on December 13th at 21:55 UTC from Vandenberg, carrying 22 Starlink V2 mini-satellites into low Earth orbit. This mission was supported by first stage B-1082, which flew for a 9th time and successfully landed on the drone ship Of Course I Still Love You. Just a few hours after that, Rocket Lab launched another HASTE mission from Wallops on December 14th at 1 o'clock UTC. Unfortunately, we don't have any details about the mission, and the company only released a streak shot of the launch. This, however, did mark the company's 15th launch of the year, quite a step up from last year. From the US, we now go to China, where the country's most powerful rocket took to the skies this week. The Tiangong 5B lifted off on December 16th at 10 o'clock UTC from Launch Complex 1 at the Wenchang Space Launch Site. The rocket was carrying 10 Guowang Internet satellites into a polar orbit. The Guowang satellites are part of China's own national satellite internet constellation, built in response to other satellite constellations like Starlink or OneWeb. The constellation, which often goes by the nickname of SatNet, is managed by China Satellite Network Group Company, a company created by the Chinese government in 2021 to kickstart this project. This is far from the only internet satellite constellation coming from China, though. Shanghai Spacecom Satellite Technology is another government-backed company which has already started deploying its Qianfan satellite constellation, this one more commonly known as the G60 constellation. Both constellations are planned to be massive, with 13,000 satellites planned for Guowang and up to 14,000 satellites planned for Qianfan. Half of those satellites need to be launched by 2032 to comply with the rules of the International Telecommunication Union, so that means China is going to need a lot of launches. In fact, one thing that surprised a lot of people was that despite using the largest rocket in China's inventory, with a capability of more than 20 tons to low Earth orbit, only 10 satellites were launched on this mission. Now, it's possible that it might have been a test run, since it was the first batch of Guowang satellites being launched, and also because this rocket was carrying a new Yuanzhong upper stage to insert the satellites into their roughly 1,100-kilometer orbit. This rocket was famous in the past for leaving its large 20-ton core stage in orbit, but thanks to this new upper stage, that didn't happen this time around. The other possibility is that these are monster satellites, each one being well over a metric ton each, in which case, then we're bound to see a lot more launches like this one in the future. This week we also had another launch from China. A Changzheng 2D rocket lifted off on December 16th at 1850 UTC from Launch Complex 9 at the Taiwan Satellite Launch Center. It was carrying 4 PiSat-2 satellites into a sun-synchronous orbit. These satellites are synthetic aperture radar satellites in X-band, flying in a wheel pattern formation around the Earth, which allows the satellites to perform interferometric radar observations of the ground. Coming back to the US, we had another Falcon 9 launch. Liftoff took place on December 17th at 52 minutes past midnight UTC from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida. The rocket was carrying the GPS-3 Space Vehicle 7 satellite into a medium Earth orbit for the US Space Force. This mission was officially known prior to launch as RRT-1, which had everyone, including us, scratching their heads trying to guess what it stood for. After the launch, the US Space Force revealed that RRT stands for Rapid Response Trailblazer. This GPS-3 satellite, the 7th in the fleet, was originally supposed to launch on ULA's Vulcan rocket, but in the middle of the summer, the Space Force decided to move it to SpaceX's Falcon 9. This move would also work as a rapid response test in which the satellite would be quickly processed for launch, going from vehicle assignment to launch within just a few months rather than 2 years or more. This might be the reason behind all of the secrecy surrounding the launch prior and during the flight, from what the actual payload was to even not covering the second stage activities as has been done on all of the previous GPS flights on Falcon 9. The first stage for this mission, B-1085, was flying for a 4th time, and it successfully successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas. The fairing halves for this mission were also flight-proven, having previously flown on the Europa Clipper mission, and after launch, they were scooped up from the ocean by the intrepid fairing recovery vessel Doug. This week, we also had a spacewalk from the Tiangong space station. The spacewalk broke the record for longest spacewalk with a total duration of 9 hours and 6 minutes from start to end. The EVA was performed by astronauts Tsai Shuja and Song Lingdong, who were assisted by the station's robotic arm. They carried out multiple tasks on the exterior of the station, including inspections of its exterior shielding and installation of debris protective panels. This spacewalk's duration beats the previous record set during the STS-102 mission by Susan Helms and James Voss, whose EVA duration clocked in at 8 hours and 56 minutes. Coming back to the ground, we had another 2 more Falcon 9 launches this week. The first of these lifted off on December 17th at 13:19 UTC from Vandenberg, carrying another batch of Starshield satellites for the NRO's Proliferated Space Architecture constellation. The first stage for this mission, B-1063, was flying for a 22nd time, and it successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship, Of Course I Still Love You. This mission marked another record turnaround time for both the launch pad and drone ship at SpaceX's West Coast facilities, shaving 9 hours off the previous record, down to about 3 days and 15 hours. Another Falcon 9 launch took place on December 17th at 22:26 UTC from Launch Complex 39A in Florida. The mission was carrying the 4th pair of SES's O3B mPOWER satellites into medium Earth orbit. These are high-throughput broadband satellites operating in medium Earth orbit, about 8,000 kilometers over the equator. SpaceX has already launched 6 of these O3B mPOWER satellites between 2022 and 2023, but power issues with the early satellites prompted SES to request a change of design from Boeing, the manufacturer of these satellites. This 4th pair of satellites is the first with this new redesigned power system, which should prevent the issues encountered on the earlier satellites. 2 more launches for this constellation are scheduled for the future, with 3 satellites scheduled for launch in mid-2025 and 2 in late 2026. This mission was a rare one as it was supported by a new Falcon 9 booster, B-1090. The booster performed its debut flight without a hitch and successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship, Just Read the Instructions. This week, we also had a launch from Japan, the Kairos rocket by private space company Space One. Liftoff took place on December 18th at 2 o'clock UTC from the company's launch pad at Spaceport Key in Japan. The rocket was carrying 5 payloads into a sun-synchronous orbit. Those payloads, however, never reached orbit. The rocket's initial liftoff and ascent seemed to go well, but according to the company, the first stage lost thrust vector control about 80 seconds into flight. The vehicle then began to cartwheel in the air for another minute or 2 before being terminated.
Did it just do a Kerbal?
This was the second launch of the Kairos rocket, the first having previously launched in March. That flight also ended in failure a mere few seconds after liftoff when the flight termination system was activated by error. This now marks the first launch failure worldwide since Falcon 9's launch failure during the Starlink Group 9-3 mission back in July. Here's hoping Space One can quickly address this issue and come back to flight in 2025. And believe it or not, there were even more launches from China this week. A Series 1S took off on December 19th at 10:18 UTC from the Dongfang-Hong Tiangong barge off the coast of Rijiao in China. The rocket was carrying 4 Tianqi Internet of Things satellites into a low Earth orbit. And in low Earth orbit, we also had another spacewalk. Yes, even those seem to be multiplying lately. This one, however, was from the Russian side of the International Space Station. The spacewalk was conducted by cosmonauts Alexei Ovchinin and Ivan Wagner, who installed a new experiment package to monitor celestial X-ray sources and retrieved other older experiments from the exterior of the station. The cosmonauts also had another task, which was to relocate a control panel for the European robotic arm, but this wasn't completed due to time constraints. This spacewalk marked the 272nd in support of the ISS. Going into the final week of the year, we have a ton more launches, but let's be real, what else were you expecting, right? SpaceX wants to launch a total of 136 Falcon flights this year, and they've completed 129 so far, which means they're gonna try and crunch 7 launches into the last 10 days of the year. The first 2 of these launches are coming up this Saturday, one from Florida and one from California. The one from Florida is set to launch 4 satellites for Astranis into a geosynchronous transfer orbit within a nearly 4-hour window that opens on December 21st at 3:39 UTC. The one from California is set to launch SpaceX's second bandwagon mission as part of the company's small-sat rideshare program. That launch is set to occur on December 21st at 11:34 UTC. Shortly thereafter, another Falcon 9 launch is set to take place from Florida, carrying a batch of Starlink satellites into orbit. The 4-hour launch window is set to open on December 23rd at 5 o'clock UTC. And on Christmas Eve, while many places on Earth will be cold and snowy, NASA's Parker Solar Probe will get the hottest and closest it's ever been to our star, the Sun. After over 6 years of operations near the Sun, the probe will reach its closest approach to our star on December 24th, coming just 6.16 million kilometers from it. This will be the first of 3 close encounters in which the spacecraft will face temperatures of nearly 1,000 degrees Celsius or 1,830 degrees Fahrenheit. While there, deep in the Sun's corona, the Parker Solar Probe will measure its atmosphere and dynamics to better understand how solar wind is produced and emitted by the Sun. Now, if that really made your temperature rise, I bet a launch from Baikonur will bring it back down because it's been pretty cold there lately. A Soyuz 2.1B rocket is set to take off from Baikonur on December 25th at 7:45 UTC, carrying the 5th Resource P satellite into a sun-synchronous orbit. We'll then have another 3 Falcon 9 launches, the first carrying the Thuraya 4 NGS satellite into geosynchronous transfer orbit. The 1.5-hour launch window for that mission is set to open on December 27th at 5 o'clock UTC. The second will launch from Vandenberg carrying a batch of Starlink satellites. The 4-hour launch window is planned to open on December 29th at 1:35 UTC. Another 4-hour launch window is set to open on December 30th at 5 o'clock UTC for another Starlink launch from the Cape as well. And one of the final launches of the year could come from India with the launch of a PSLV rocket carrying the SpadeX mission into low Earth orbit. The 4-hour launch window is set to open on December 30th at 1600 UTC. Now, there are, of course, many more things that could happen between now and the end of the year. There could even be an extra Falcon launch here and there, and there's probably other unannounced launches that might pop up unexpectedly as well. We're keeping an eye on Blue Origin's New Glenn, which is trying to get its pre-launch hot fire test done before the end of the year, and the company may try a quick turnaround from hot fire to launch attempt as well. Also in our minds is Starship, which recently got a license for its 7th launch, so SpaceX could give us a surprise with that one as well. As always, be sure to check out nextspaceflight.com for real-time updates on the launch schedule. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Elysia Segal for NSF, and next week we'll be on vacation for the holidays. But don't fret, we'll be back again in the new year with a special edition of This Week in Spaceflight, where we'll take a look at next year in spaceflight. So, happy holidays, and we'll see you in 2025. The other passengers on this flight were SpaceX principal propulsion. The other passengers on this flight were SpaceX principal propulsion, and it worked. Oh my God. Okay.